At 11:24 a.m., on September 19th, 1944, deep in the fields outside Ericourt, France, a young American mechanic named Private First Class Jack Turner crouched inside a rumbling M4 Sherman tank as the world around him shook itself apart. Through the slit of the periscope, smoke rolled across the fields like gray ghosts. And beyond that fog, 3 German Panzer IVs were closing fast. 600 yards, maybe less. Jack's hands were slick with sweat and engine oil. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the tank's roaring engine. 2 days earlier, the man who'd sat in his place had been killed instantly when a Panzer shell punched through the turret wall. Now Jack was the replacement, the untested rookie, a 23-year-old from Detroit who had spent his life fixing trucks, not fighting wars. He had loaded exactly 4 practice shells before this morning, and now, with the ground trembling and orders shouting through the intercom, every second mattered. The commander yelled coordinates, the gunner barked about traverse speed, and somewhere below, the driver threw the Sherman into reverse, trying to angle them behind a hedgerow. But there was no cover, no time, and Jack was the one thing standing between his crew and silence. He reached for the first round, 38 pounds of high-explosive, cold brass against his palm, and tried to remember the instructions from Fort Knox. Grip the shell nose forward, align the base with the breech, slam it home, and step clear. 4 seconds if you're good, 5 if you're nervous. He was already on 6. The tank lurched, the gunner's shoulder slammed into his arm, and the shell nearly slipped. The Panzer rounds screamed closer, cutting the air like razors. Jack's training fought with instinct. He turned to face the breach again, but the cramped turret left no room. His left elbow struck metal, pain shot through his arm, and the gunner cursed. The commander shouted, "They're at 600! Load it, Turner, now!" In that instant, something snapped. Not panic, but clarity. Jack did something no manual had ever suggested. Instead of facing the gun, he turned his back to it. He reached behind him blindly with his left hand, feeling for the hot metal rim of the breech. His right hand gripped the base of the shell. The moment his fingers found the opening, muscle memory took over. He shoved hard. The round slid perfectly into place, and the breech slammed shut with a metallic crack. "Up!" he shouted. The gunner fired. The thunderclap filled the turret. Heat washed over Jack's neck, and smoke poured through the chamber. He didn't stop. Before the echo of the first shot faded, he grabbed another shell. Same motion, back turned, left hand guiding, right hand ramming. 3 seconds, then another. 2.5. His arms ached, his ears rang, but the rhythm took hold. Fire, load, fire, load. The tank rocked under each recoil, each explosion outside shaking the earth. Through the periscope, flashes of orange marked where the shells landed. 1 Panzer erupted, then another, then a third. The last one tried to turn away, its turret smoking, before Jack slammed the 4th round home and the Sherman's gun roared again. 6 minutes later, the field went quiet except for the low hiss of burning armor. 4 German tanks lay in flames across the ridge. The crew sat frozen, the smell of cordite thick in the air. The gunner stared at Jack like he was seeing a ghost. The commander climbed down from his hatch and looked at the loader who was still standing with his back to the cannon, hands blackened, breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" he asked. Jack didn't answer. He didn't have one. He only knew that for reasons he couldn't explain, the movement had worked. He had done everything backwards, against training, against logic, against every rule written since the Sherman first rolled off the line. But somehow, it had saved them. Later that night, word spread across the company. They laughed about it in the mess tent, calling him the backward loader, the crazy kid from Detroit who got lucky once. But luck had nothing to do with it. What the others called madness would soon become the method that saved hundreds of American crews. To understand how that could happen, You have to know what life was like inside a Sherman tank in 1944. What it felt like to be sealed inside a steel box that soldiers quietly called the tin coffin. The M4 Sherman was never meant to fight toe-to-toe with the German Panzers. When it was designed in 1941, the war was young, and the tank's job was to support infantry, not to duel in open fields. Its 75mm gun could punch through the armor of early German tanks, but by 1944, those same rounds flattened harmlessly against the thick plates of a Panzer IV or Panther. The Germans knew it. American tankers knew it. On paper, the plan was simple. 5 Shermans could outflank 1 German tank. In practice, it meant that 4 of those Shermans were likely to burn before the 5th found a weak spot. Among crews, it became a dark saying, the 4-for-1 ratio, a grim reminder that, in France that summer, survival was the exception, not the rule. For the men who lived inside those tanks, the enemy was not only the shell that came from a mile away, but the machine itself. The interior was barely 7 feet across, lined with ammunition racks and metal corners sharp enough to split skin. The air smelled of grease, gunpowder, and fear. When the gun fired, the recoil slammed through the turret like a hammer, and the echo deafened everyone inside. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees. Loader, gunner, commander, driver, assistant driver, 5 men, each with inches of personal space, all breathing the same recycled air. Every movement had to be perfect, because one wrong elbow, one dropped shell, could mean instant death. For Jack Turner, the position of loader was both the heart and the hazard of that world. He stood to the right of the cannon, between the ready rack of shells and the breech that could snap shut like a bear trap. When a German round struck the hull, the shockwave knocked loose dust and rust from every seam, raining down like red snow. Jack learned fast that fear could not slow your hands, because the tank that fired first usually lived. And yet, the Sherman made even that rule unfair. Its turret had no stabilizer. Every bump in the field sent the gun lurching, forcing the loader to time his motion with the rhythm of the tank itself. A moment too soon, and the breech might shear his fingers off. Too late, and the enemy's shot would reach them first. Left-handed loaders like Jack had it worse. The design of the turret assumed a right-handed man, his strong arm leading, his weaker one guiding the shell. For a left-hander, everything was reversed. To face the breach properly, he had to twist his body and lead with his right arm, the one that lacked control. His left elbow flared wide, often smashing into the gunner's shoulder or the traverse wheel. It slowed him by 2 seconds, sometimes more. 2 seconds might seem trivial in a factory or a workshop. In a tank duel, it was the space between life and nothingness. Veterans joked that you could tell a left-handed loader by the bruises on his arm and the burns on his neck. But there was no humor when the shells started flying. In those moments, muscle memory was supposed to save you. But for men like Jack, muscle memory was a liability. The Army had trained every loader to work the same way, to mirror the same motion drilled at Fort Knox. Nobody questioned it because that's how manuals were written, and manuals, like orders, were meant to be obeyed. Yet on the battlefields of France, that training began to crack under the weight of reality. Crews improvised to stay alive. Some welded extra armor to the hull. Others hung sandbags or spare tracks on the front. But nothing could change the geometry inside. The loader still had to move, turn, and ram a shell through 24 inches of space while the tank rocked under fire. And when the gunner missed, when the enemy's shot hit home, the loader was the first to die. His seat was next to the ammunition rack, and if a round penetrated, the ready shells cooked off in a white-hot chain reaction that turned steel to vapor. The men who survived often said it was like sitting inside a furnace waiting for the lid to open. Jack saw the wrecks along the roads of Lorraine, the blackened hulks with open hatches where crews had tried to escape and hadn't made it. Each one was a warning. Speed is life. But the faster he tried to load, the more the cramped space fought him. His body was the wrong shape for the dance the army demanded. Every bump in the ground, every recoil reminded him that he didn't fit the mold. Still, he kept trying, day after day, round after round, his left arm carrying the weight his right couldn't control. Somewhere deep inside, frustration turned to focus. He began to study the way his body moved in the narrow turret, watching how his shoulders lined up, how the breech angled toward his hip instead of his chest. He didn't know it yet, but he was already searching for a different rhythm, one that didn't depend on rules or manuals, one that fit the man, not the machine. By mid-September, the crew of the Lucky Lady had already been through 3 replacements. They slept in their tank, ate in their tank, and prayed they wouldn't burn in it. They joked that every shell they loaded had their name written on it, one way or another. And in the middle of that exhausted crew sat a young mechanic from Detroit, a man whose left-handed problem in a right-handed war was about to change the way an entire army fought. He didn't yet know the cost of that discovery, or how close he was to finding it. All he knew was that the battle was coming again, and this time, he would have to find a way to keep up, or die trying. 2 days later, that moment arrived. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the fields of Lorraine were covered in a thin fog that smelled of wet iron and smoke. The Lucky Lady moved with a column of Shermans across the low ridges east of Ericourt, part of the 4th Armored Division's push to blunt a surprise German counterattack. The night before, rain had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Now, as the sun rose, the mist glowed like silver, and from somewhere beyond it came the unmistakable crack of tank guns. Jack Turner sat in his station, wiping sweat and oil from his palms, listening to the rhythmic whine of the turret motors. It wasn't fear anymore that made his hands shake. It was memory. Every time he touched the brass casing of a shell, he thought of the men who hadn't made it this far. Somewhere inside him, the fear had hardened into something quieter, heavier, determination. Then the first impact came. A German round ricocheted off the Sherman's glacis plate, hitting at just the wrong angle. The tank shuddered like a struck bell. Jack was thrown sideways into the wall of the turret, his right shoulder slamming hard against the steel bracket that held the intercom box. Pain exploded through his arm. For a second, he couldn't breathe. His shoulder had popped clean out of its socket. The commander, Sergeant Frank Dalton, yelled through the headset, asking if he was alive. Jack gasped, "I'm good." But he wasn't. When the medic reached them later, he reset the joint with a rough pull and told him flatly, "You're done for now, soldier." But Dalton refused to lose another loader. The division was already short-handed. 18 tanks had been knocked out in 2 days. He looked at Jack and said, "If you can move one arm, you're still my loader." That was the Army's way in 1944. There was no time to stop, no room to rest. The next morning, before dawn, the Lucky Lady rolled back into formation. The air was thick with low fog, muffling sound and blurring distance. Then came the voices over the radio. German armor advancing from the east, 3 Panzers moving fast across open ground. Dalton barked orders, and the gunner swung the turret toward the shapes in the mist. Jack reached for the first shell with his left hand. His right arm hung useless at his side, every movement a flash of fire. He tried to load the normal way, facing the breech, both hands on the shell, but the pain was unbearable. The round tipped, scraping against the rim. The gunner snapped, "Hurry, Turner!" The commander shouted coordinates. The Panzers were closing. Jack felt the tank rock beneath him as they hit a ditch. His balance shifted, and instinct took over. He stopped thinking about the manual, about the right way or the wrong way. He just did what his body told him to do. He turned his back to the breach. His left hand felt for the opening, like finding a keyhole in the dark. He guided the shell by touch alone, lined it up, and drove it home with everything he had. The breech slammed shut. The gunner fired. The recoil shoved hot air and smoke against his back, burning the edge of his uniform. He didn't care. He was already reaching for the next round. The same movement, back turned, left hand leading, left shoulder driving the weight forward. The rhythm came naturally, the motion shorter, cleaner, more powerful than anything the manual had taught. 3 seconds per shot, then 2.5. The gun thundered again and again. Through the commander's hatch, Dalton saw 3 bursts of fire bloom across the field. The Panzers kept coming, but slower now. The second round hit one square in the turret, blowing it apart. The third smashed into the side of another Somme, setting it ablaze. Jack's left arm burned from strain, but he didn't stop. He loaded 9 rounds in 4 minutes. When the last German tank retreated behind the tree line, silence fell except for the hum of the engine and the hiss of cooling metal. The air inside the Sherman was thick with smoke, turning everything gray. Jack slumped against the wall, his right arm limp, his left trembling. Dalton looked down from the commander's hatch, eyes wide. "How the hell did you do that?" Jack didn't answer right away. He didn't have the words for it. It had felt wrong and right at the same time, like his body had solved a problem his mind couldn't see. The gunner finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "You were loading in 3 seconds flat." Jack blinked, surprised. "That fast?" "Faster," Dalton said. "You just did what every loader's been trying to do since we got to France." Jack looked at his blackened hands. The skin on his knuckles blistered from heat. "I just did it backwards," he muttered. Outside, the fog was lifting. The wrecks of the Panzers burned orange in the morning light. Dalton climbed down and looked through the open hatch at his crew. They were all silent, trying to process what had just happened. For months, the Sherman had been the underdog, the outgunned machine that survived by numbers and luck. But here, in this tiny turret, a single mechanic from Detroit had found a way to bend the rules of war by turning them around. None of them knew what it meant yet, but the truth was spreading already, in glances, in whispers, in the way soldiers talk after a battle. That afternoon, another tank crew asked Dalton how they'd done it. He just smiled and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." But in the days that followed, others would try. And when they did, they'd discover that what started as an accident wasn't an accident at all. It was evolution. What one left-handed mechanic had done to survive was about to challenge everything the Army thought it knew about how to fight a tank war. The question now wasn't whether it worked, but how long it could stay a secret. Word traveled through the ranks faster than any official order. By the evening of September 18th, men from neighboring platoons were whispering about a kid from Detroit who could load faster than anyone they'd ever seen. They called it the backward trick, half in jest, half in disbelief. No one outside Jack Turner's crew had actually witnessed it, but soldiers didn't need proof. They needed hope. And hope spreads quickly in a war where survival is measured in seconds. Within a day, 2 other loaders in 4th Armored tried to imitate it. They didn't turn their backs entirely. They just shifted their stance, testing how far they could twist before the commander noticed. The results were immediate. Faster reloads, smoother movements, fewer jammed shells. But the trick came with a problem far greater than coordination. It broke nearly every rule written in the Army's most sacred technical manual. The Sherman's Field Bible, TM 9731A, was clear. Loaders were to face the breach, maintain visual contact, use both hands, and step clear after loading. Those weren't suggestions. They were commandments born from hard lessons. 3 times during the North Africa campaign, Misaligned rounds had detonated inside a tank, killing entire crews. The manual's rules were the Army's insurance against chaos, against human error. Turning your back to a live cannon was unthinkable, a violation that could court-martial any loader caught doing it. Yet in France, Jack's small rebellion was rewriting the unwritten law of survival. Sergeant Frank Dalton understood the risk. If headquarters found out that his loader had gone rogue, he'd lose his command. Still, he'd seen the proof himself. 9 rounds loaded in 4 minutes, 4 enemy tanks destroyed, his crew alive. The cost of obedience, he realized, could be death. So he made a choice. In his after-action report, he wrote only one sentence about Turner's performance. Exceptional rate of fire observed. Nothing more. No explanation. No mention of how. The rest he buried in silence. For Jack, the battle's aftermath was strange. He wasn't treated as a hero or a genius, just another man lucky enough to survive. In the eyes of the Army, he'd done nothing extraordinary. But inside the cramped walls of the Lucky Lady, his crew knew better. They practiced the motion again that night, quietly, by lantern light, reaching back, feeling for the breach, perfecting the movement like a secret handshake. Each repetition felt smoother, faster, more natural. They said nothing to the other crews, not yet. But by morning, a corporal from another tank asked Dalton if it was true, if his loader had really broken 4 Panzers in 6 minutes. Dalton didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. "We just did what we had to do," he said. That was enough. Soldiers filled in the rest. Whispers grew into stories, and stories grew into belief. Soon, backward loading became a phrase muttered with equal parts awe and suspicion. Some called it dangerous nonsense. Others called it a miracle. The truth was that both were right. The method worked because it defied logic. By turning his back, Jack had changed the geometry of the turret. Instead of pushing the 38-pound shell forward with outstretched arms, he used the stronger muscles of his shoulder and back, driving the round into the breach with half the effort and half the distance. It wasn't safe, but it was fast. And in war, speed was safety. Still, every time Jack performed the motion, he knew he was one mistake away from disaster. If the shell misaligned, it could jam the breach. If the gunner fired too soon, the recoil could crush him against the turret wall. But something in him had shifted. After surviving that first battle, the fear that once ruled him had been replaced by a quiet defiance. The manual might save lives in training. Out here, it was getting men killed. "If following the rules means dying by them," he told Dalton one night, "then maybe the rules need to change." Dalton didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said he agreed. A few days later, a supply officer conducting inspections stopped by their position. He checked weapons, rations, and ammunition logs. When he reached the Lucky Lady, he paused, noticing the scuffed pattern on the turret floor. "Your loader standing backward?" he asked, half joking. Dalton's pulse spiked. "Tank gets rough," he replied evenly. "Men shift around." The officer shrugged, signed the clipboard, and moved on. It was a close call, a reminder of how thin the line was between innovation and insubordination. By late September, combat reports from multiple battalions mentioned improved firing rates in several Sherman crews, numbers that didn't make sense according to standard training. Headquarters noticed, but no one could explain it. To the generals, it was just another anomaly in the chaos of war. To the men on the ground, it was survival's best-kept secret. Yet secrets like that never stay buried for long. Each day brought new replacements, young men straight from Fort Knox, trained by the book, stepping into tanks with crews who had already thrown the book away. It was only a matter of time before someone with rank saw what they were doing. The question was, what would happen then? Would the Army punish the men who broke its rules, or learn from them? The fog of war has a way of blurring such lines, turning defiance into doctrine before anyone realizes it. And soon, one of the Army's most ambitious commanders would see the impossible for himself. What started as a rumor whispered behind steel walls was about to reach the ears of a general who cared about only one thing: results. It began quietly, an offhand remark in an after-action debrief, a line in a field report that didn't match expectations. Commanders noticed crews in the 37th Tank Battalion were firing faster, hitting more often, and surviving encounters they should have lost. No one could explain it. There was no new weapon, no upgraded gun, no special ammunition. The only difference was the loaders. Something had changed in how they worked, and that difference was rewriting the math of battle. When Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th, reviewed those reports, he didn't see coincidence. He saw potential. Abrams was a rare kind of leader, a man who measured success not by protocol, but by performance. He had built his reputation on speed, aggression, and results. When others hesitated, he advanced. When others saw danger, he saw opportunity. And now, the data on his desk showed a mystery worth chasing. He wanted to see it himself. On a gray morning in late September, Abrams arrived unannounced at the forward position of the 4th Armored Division. He found Sergeant Frank Dalton's crew preparing for another push toward Nancy. The lucky lady sat half-covered in mud, her crew exhausted but alive. Abrams, a tall, sharp-eyed man with a calm authority, asked Dalton to demonstrate their loading drill. Dalton hesitated. Showing a superior officer something that directly violated the manual could end his career. But Abrams's tone left no room for argument. "Show me," he said simply. Jack Turner stepped into the turret, his shoulder still bandaged beneath his uniform. He looked at Dalton, who gave a small nod. "Go ahead." The gunner called out, "Up." Jack turned his back to the breach and moved with the precision of a craftsman who had done it 100 times. In one motion, he felt for the opening, slid the shell into place and rammed it home. The metallic snap echoed in the turret. Abrams's eyes narrowed. "Again," he said. Jack repeated the movement, faster this time. The colonel checked his watch. 3 seconds flat. Again. 2.9. Abrams watched in silence, absorbing every detail, the stance, the leverage, the efficiency. It was risky, yes, but also brilliant. When Jack finished, breathing hard, Abrams asked one question. "Does it work in combat?" Dalton didn't hesitate. "Sir, it keeps us alive." Abrams gave a short nod. "Then it's standard, effective immediately." And with that, the backward loading method was no longer a secret. Within 24 hours, every loader in the 37th Battalion was ordered to learn the new technique. There were no written directives, no official memos, just demonstrations passed from crew to crew. The results were undeniable. Engagement times dropped from 12 minutes to 8. Hit ratios improved. Crews who once feared meeting German armor head-on now fought with confidence. The method spread like wildfire through the 4th Armored Division, not because it was authorized, but because it worked. A few officers resisted, clinging to the manual, warning that one misstep could kill a man, but Abrams brushed them aside. "Regulations don't win wars," he said. "Men do." Word of his decision reached headquarters within days, and that's when it reached someone far higher than Abrams, a man whose name carried both fear and legend, General George S. Patton. Patton's Third Army had been driving east since the breakout from Normandy, moving faster and farther than anyone thought possible. His tanks were his pride, his soldiers his instruments of momentum. Every innovation that gave them an edge mattered to him. So when his staff briefed him on Abrams's unconventional method, Patton didn't scold or dismiss it. He demanded to see it. On October 7, 1944, under a pale sky at division headquarters near the Moselle River, Patton stood beside a row of Shermans, his gloves tucked under one arm, his riding crop in hand. "Show me this trick of yours," he said. Jack Turner was brought forward again, the same young mechanic who had once been ridiculed for breaking procedure. The demonstration began. The first shell went in, 3 seconds. The second, 2.8. The third, 2.9. Patton timed each one himself, stopwatch in hand, his face unreadable. When the final round slammed into the breach, he turned to his staff. "It works," he said flatly. "Then make it doctrine." In that instant, a single soldier's desperation-born idea became Army policy. Patton ordered every armored battalion in the Third Army to adopt the backward loading method immediately. Any officer who punished a man for using it would answer directly to him. The message spread down the chain faster than any official order. By mid-October, over 4,000 Shermans across 11 divisions were using the technique. Within weeks, the numbers spoke for themselves. Kill ratios that once stood at 4-1 against the Americans dropped to nearly even. Crews lived longer. Battles ended faster. A method born in the panic of a fog-covered field had turned into a strategic advantage. For the first time in months, the tankers of Patton's army were no longer defined by fear but by innovation. They had learned that survival didn't come from obeying rules. It came from adapting them. Yet amid the celebration, Jack Turner remained just a name on a roster. There were no medals, no commendations, no headlines. The Army credited the improvement to enhanced crew coordination. The official reports didn't mention that the man who'd inspired it was a left-handed mechanic from Detroit. He wasn't there for recognition, anyway. While generals took notes and officers issued orders, Jack sat on the Lucky Lady's hull, watching the sunset over the French hills, the air still thick with the smell of burnt fuel. He had no idea that his small act of instinct had changed the course of armored warfare. But history has a way of overlooking the ordinary men who make extraordinary choices. The war was far from over, and Jack's story was not yet finished, because once the guns went silent and the manuals were rewritten, another question would remain. Would anyone remember the man who had dared to turn his back? When the war in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the fields of Lorraine that had once echoed with cannon fire fell into silence. The tanks were parked in long rows, their engines cold, their barrels pointed toward nothing. For the men who had lived inside those steel walls, the quiet was deafening. Private First Class Jack Turner packed his duffel on a warm morning in June, one of the last to leave his unit. He didn't make speeches or linger for photographs. He just shook hands with Sergeant Frank Dalton, who said simply, "You kept us alive, kid," and climbed aboard the truck that would take him home. There were no parades waiting for men like him, no medals, no front-page stories, no mention of the backward loader. In official records, his name appeared on a single line among thousands. Honorably discharged, Detroit, Michigan. Back home, the war already felt like another lifetime. America was moving forward, busy rebuilding, busy forgetting. Jack went back to what he knew best, machines. He took a job at the Ford River Rouge plant, the same place he'd worked before the draft notice arrived. He married a woman named Eleanor in 1947, bought a modest house on the edge of the city, and started a family. To his co-workers, he was quiet, steady, dependable. They never knew that his hands, blackened from years on the assembly line, had once fed shells into a gun that changed how an army fought. He never told them. Maybe it was humility. Maybe it was the unspoken rule of his generation, that the men who came back didn't need to talk about what they'd seen. The world was too busy celebrating peace to ask what it had cost. Yet the method he had created in desperation refused to fade away. The backward load, as it came to be known among tankers, lived on in the way crews trained, even when the manuals still denied it existed. In the years after the war, the U.S. Army studied its own performance with the cold precision of engineers. They noticed that from late 1944 onward, the survival rate of Sherman crews in the Third Army had risen by almost 20%. The statistics didn't explain why, but veterans did. They passed it down to replacements, showing the motion quietly, as if teaching a secret handshake from another era. When the Korean War began in 1950, American tank crews, many now using modified Shermans, were still loading the way Jack Turner once had. Reports from the Pusan perimeter told of Marine tankers who could fire 2 rounds faster than their North Korean counterparts could fire 1. Decades later, in Vietnam, the technique was adapted again for the M48 Patton's 90mm gun. Instructors at Fort Knox called it the reverse grip method. They taught it to young loaders who didn't know its origin, only that it worked. Some of those instructors had fought in Korea. A few had fought in France. All of them had learned, directly or indirectly, from a man who never knew his name would echo that far. The world moved on. Tanks changed, technology advanced, automatic loading systems replaced human hands. But for more than 40 years, the ghost of Jack Turner's motion lingered inside every turret built by American hands. By the time he retired from Ford in 1986, the Army had already begun phasing out manual loaders entirely. The last generation to learn his technique would serve on early M1 Abrams tanks, still taught to feel the breach before automation took over. History had caught up with him, but it had also passed him by. In 1993, a military historian researching armored warfare stumbled across an after-action report from the 4th Armored Division. It mentioned unusually fast reload times during the Aracourt engagement, but no explanation. Curious, the historian traced unit rosters, then veteran registries, until he found an aging mechanic living quietly outside Detroit. When he called, the voice on the other end was calm, modest, with the faint rasp of a man who had spent a lifetime around machines. "I just did what I had to," Jack said. "It wasn't special. Anyone could have done it." The historian disagreed. His research estimated that the loading method had saved hundreds of American tank crews from late 1944 to the end of the war. Jack listened quietly, thanked him for the call, and hung up. He never sought recognition after that, never signed the papers that might have given his story a name. When he passed away in 2004 at the age of 83, his obituary mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, a husband, a father, and a lifelong mechanic. It did not mention that he had changed the way soldiers fought and lived. But history, even when it forgets names, remembers impact. Today, inside the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, a restored Sherman sits behind glass. The turret is preserved exactly as it was in 1944. The same narrow space, the same sharp metal corners, the same loader's station on the right side of the gun. Visitors can peer inside and see where a man once turned his back to the cannon to defy a manual and outsmart death. There's no plaque that bears his name, no caption that tells his story, only a simple line that reads, "Innovations developed in the field improved crew efficiency and survival." Yet those who know, those who served, understand what that really means. They still talk about it sometimes, in reunions and online forums the way old soldiers do, half technical, half reverent. They call it Turner's trick, though most admit they don't know who Turner was. The truth is, they don't need to, because his story isn't just about one man. It's about every soldier who ever looked at a rule and realized it didn't fit the world around him. It's about the courage to think differently when everything depends on conformity. It's about the quiet kind of heroism that doesn't need medals to matter. Somewhere in that museum, the sunlight filters through the glass and touches the breech of that old 75mm gun. The metal gleams softly, as if remembering the hands that once gave it purpose. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost imagine a young mechanic from Detroit reaching back one more time, feeling for the rim, trusting instinct over instruction. They laughed at him once, but his backward idea kept an army alive and proved that sometimes the right way forward is backwards.